In the late 20th century, the most influential and the most controversial study of fundamentalism was the Fundamentalism Project, that was a series of 5 volumes edited by the American scholars Martin E. Marty and R. Scott Appleby. Marty and Appleby viewed religious fundamentalism primarily as the militant rejection of secular modernity. They argued that fundamentalism is not just traditional religiosity, but an inherently political phenomenon, though this dimension may sometimes be dormant. In addition, they contended that fundamentalism is inherently totalitarian, insofar as it seeks to remake all aspects of society and government on religious practices. We are here because we are people of faith. Within each of us lives the conviction of a saving faith that could restore our broken planet and illuminate the lives of our sisters and brothers. Ancient wisdom teaches that we who would save the world must first save ourselves. We who would restore the planet must learn to restore the broken structures of the institutions closest to hand, to illuminate the lives of our companions and friends. To this end, let us center ourselves, acknowledging the trouble of mind and vexation of spirit that accompany us even here. Let us open ourselves to that creative mystery which is at work in our striving, whose servants we are and seek to be. So have you all looked on this? I thought this was great. Doug picked that out. God hates the USA. USA loves free speech. God hates free speech. God hates Westboro Baptist. I love that. And then the last guy says, think, what's that? It kind of reminds me of, they hate everybody. And like 1970 or 1971, I was from Lancaster, and I went to the First Baptist Church of Lancaster. Susie went to some little Church of Christ church at that time, but we knew each other. I was a student at Mountain View College in Dallas, and a group wanted me to go to this conference in Hammond, Indiana. Anybody been to Hammond, Indiana before? So I went up there. It was the First Baptist Church of Hammond, Indiana. It was a huge church. There was the pastor of that church was named Jack Howells. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this guy, but if you looked at Jack Howells, you'll realize Jerry Falwell was liberal. This guy was so far to the right, but they had a huge, I don't remember if any of you remember things they called bus ministries many years ago. Baptist churches were really big on that. They wanted to pick up every kid in town and all that kind of thing. But after going up there for 3 or 4 days, I realized that fundamentalism was not for me. This church literally hated everyone. Everything, everyone. So, in my last message, when we talked about the indicators of the 19th century that pointed to this evolution of this 20th century phenomenon of religious fundamentalism, I quoted in my past messages from various sources. This new religious movement is a rejection of modernity. We just listened when I read this little thing about Martin Marty and R. Scott Appleby saying it was the militant rejection of secular modernity. In that message, I'd quoted from Karen Armstrong and Grant Wacker, who's a theologian at Duke. And now I've just talked about Martin Marty and this Dr. Appleby. all have been very concerned with the rise of this phenomenon even into the 21st century. In fact, the two scholars in their 5-volume project stated that religious fundamentalism is inherently totalitarian. If that doesn't scare us, that's a real problem. As fundamentalism started to evolve in the late 19th century, several groups and schools became intertwined in this movement. Some of the things I've researched out over the years, the Presbyterian Church of all places is really where the first little congregation to jump on this starts. And then some Pentecostal groups jump onto it, and then some fringe Baptist groups. In that late 19th century and early 20th century, you see a lot of these, what they were kind of fringe groups then, but it was a splintering of mainline denominations starts to take place. So in the 19th century, mid-19th century, wherever there were two Baptist groups. There was the Northern American Baptist and the Southern Baptist. Southern Baptists are split from the Northern Baptists because they wanted slavery. And it's the bottom line to that. So these other groups start to splinter. And today, if you want to talk about Baptists, there's 200-something denominations of Baptists. So they held these meetings in the late 19th, early 20th century to address modernity and its parting from traditional Christian ideals and theological modernism. These new groups and some of their early leaders set forth a core set of Christian beliefs, historical accuracy, and inerrancy of the Bible. Now, when you consider that part, they do not accept science if it goes and contradicts the inerrancy or the historical accuracy thing that they believe in. So science is secondary. Doesn't matter if it's staring them in the face. The evolution, the age of the earth or the world. The other one is this imminent and physical second coming of Jesus Christ and Christ's virgin birth. Oh, heaven help you if you say you don't believe in that virgin birth. Resurrection and atonement. It started slow, but gained traction over the years. Some of the early guys, Dwight L. Moody was a guy that was big early on. There's a guy that has my last name. It was from Fort Worth, and he originally was a Southern Baptist and broke away. And y'all know, have you ever heard of J. Frank Norris? Okay, well, I had an uncle, and his name was Joe Frank Norris, and man, they used to give him a hard time about that. But J. Frank Norris was the pastor of First Baptist Church of Fort Worth. He was connected to Southwestern Seminary at that time, but eventually broke from that and became a part of this early fundamentalist group. And then the other guy was a guy named Billy Sunday. He had been a professional baseball player, then became an evangelist. And then in mid-20th century, there's another evangelist that rises up, Billy Graham. But he kind of pulls away from some of that in his later life. So understand that part of it. I remember Mark a few weeks ago, he addressed some of this stuff about fundamentalism. He talked about how these groups, the scripture is everything in religious fundamentalism. It doesn't matter whether it's Christianity or these other ones. Their writings or whatever they hold on to, those take precedence over anything else. It's almost like you worship those scriptures. but Mark talked about some of that, and then the important thing here, part of it is, he said that today many people worship Jesus, or they say they do. They worship Jesus, but then Mark said they don't follow Jesus. And the reality is you're supposed to follow. Because that's what, if you looked at the Bible, that's what it says. I mean, Jesus says, follow me. He didn't say worship me. So that's part of this issue that takes place. So that scripture thing is so important, because this really has become a big issue in the United States. So right now we're still just talking about the 20th century. 21st century has to be another message, because there's too much going on today. But so what I'd like to do is kind of explain to you what took place with the Southern Baptist Convention and how they totally turned around, turned over, and were totally taken over by the far right-wing side of the Southern Baptist. Through the years, the Southern Baptist had two parts to it. There was this Baptist convention, this denomination, but in that denomination, they would always have these meetings in the summer, their convention meetings, like, Unitarians have convention meetings or whatever, or all denominations do. There was a thing called the Pastors' Conference. And out of that Pastors' Conference, it stayed with this far right-wing thing from the early 20s, really. And so the power base in that got stronger and stronger and stronger through the years, to where it really took control of the Southern Baptist Convention. But the Southern Baptists were impressed with another denomination, the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. And it had done something similar some previous years. And they had gotten rid of what they thought were their moderate or liberal theologians and taken control of their denomination. So the Southern Baptists used some of their tactics so they could do their takeover. The mid-60s, 1960s, was important, because this is when they had student unrest, then you had the civil rights movement, you had the civil rights laws passed, and they had a hard time dealing with that. So they started in the late 60s to pool their money and do something, to try to change and take over the denomination. So it's going on along. In the 70s, it's rocky, but in 1979, the Southern Baptists elected their first far-right preacher, theologian, whatever. And it was a guy out of Memphis, Tennessee by the name of Adrian Rogers. And so it starts to crescendo at that point and to take control. And it takes some years for it to do, but it starts in 1979. And what's important by having that one person in power? What did from 2016 to 2020, what was important for many of those fundamentalists with Trump? What would he do? He would appoint people. He appointed judges to the benches, federal benches and all that, that changed everything. And we're in a stalemate. This is what the Southern Baptists did. What the Republicans are doing today have taken from where some of these denominations have done the same thing and used some of their tactics. So they started stacking these boards and everything. But one particular person who fought back during much of this was a guy by the name of Russell Doubleday. So he had become the president of Southwestern Baptist Seminary in 1978. The fundamentalists were real upset over that. They did not like him. He was a pastor of a large church outside of Atlanta, but he was ecumenical, a little bit interfaith oriented, and he was a moderate. He considered himself a Christian traditionalist, but what he did that they didn't like was he was strict on that wall between church and state. I mean, things like you and I believe, that's what he pushed. He did not believe that, the Southern Baptists should start getting all involved in the Republican Party, and that was what was happening. And so he stayed from 1978 to 1994 when they ousted him out of that seminary. The day that they fired him, no more than 2 hours before they fired him, they were telling him how much they loved him and it was going to keep him on. But in 2 hours time period, they had fired him. But he fought back all during this time period. It became a very political thing. It was really what they wanted. They did not like him. At one point, he had the governor of Texas come to speak to the seminary. Well, many schools would have the governor. The governor just happened to be a Democrat, so it was Mark White. I don't remember if you remember Mark White. He's the guy that started that testing for the teachers, which probably wasn't a good idea, but he did do that. But he did some of those things, and they just didn't, But when that 1994 thing ended with him being fired, that was the end of it. They had no more strength to fight back, and the Southern Baptists just took off like that. But it has invaded many of the denominations through the years. There was one thing that in the evangelical thing, the white supremacy thing is part of this issue. In the mid-1960s, there was a guy by the name of Bob Jones. I'm not talking about, not the Bob Jones from Bob Jones University, but this guy was the head of the KKK in North Carolina. And he somehow got into trouble. This shows you how things have flipped now. So he had to go before Congress and due to an investigation, and he took the fifth, so he wouldn't talk. And back then those guys who were in the KKK, most of this is Southern people or Midwest. So Indiana's a problematic state with the KKK. So be aware of that. But these guys were kind of hard-nosed guys, and they did not like communism. Communism plays into this thing as well, the rise of the Soviet Union. So they thought anybody that took the fifth was a communist. So they pushed Bob Jones out. They disbanded and joined the Republican Party. So this is kind of how this thing starts to evolve over a period of some years. That white supremacy thing is there. But that core belief thing, now you'll even find some African-American churches, you'll find some Latino churches who kind of fall into some of this. They've allowed that part of it to take over. But usually they shy away from some of the political stuff that some of the other ones will do. But the Scopes trial was the first what many scholars say is the first public showing of religious fundamentalism. So everybody's seen that movie? Well, Spencer Tracy and who plays Williams Jennings Bryan? I can't remember. So they have that big debate. Yeah. So even out of that deal, even though the anti-evolution people win the court case, they lose the battle in the press, and so there's not a they in reality they don't win, and that fundamentalism thing is kind of underground for many years. Then what takes place mid-20th century, somewhere in there, like in the 50s, they stop having school prayer. And you ever been in a church where they just cannot stand that there's no prayer in school anymore? All our kids are going to hell? I mean, that's what happened. That's what I would sit and listen to. And so I know Jim was in a Baptist church and had gone to a Baptist school as well. Did they do any of that at where y'all went? But it gained traction over the years. It also married up with, they felt like capitalism was the same thing as Christianity. So in comes money. They support capitalist venues, whatever, in comes money, and they're able to continue that stride. So what about other places? Is there religious fundamental? We know that most scholars believe religious fundamentalism started in the United States, and it started with the evangelical movement. But it does start to take place probably mid-century is probably a good place for that. What has just happened mid-century? What had just happened a few years before? Mid-20th century. World War II, exactly. Korean War. What is the big thing that happens after World War II?
You have a restructuring of society based on women going to work and being financially independent.
Yeah. What I'm looking for is Israel. Israel becomes a state, right? Yes. I was at 1947, 1948. Many people try to tell the UK, or we called it Great Britain then, not to get involved and not to allow that to happen. But the world went ahead and did that. So out of that situation, this is where many of the Middle Eastern countries start to come into play with fundamentalism. It's a kind of a political thing that pushes them that way. Many of them are starting to get their, the colonial countries are no longer in control of these countries now, like the UK had been in control of many. So many of these Middle Eastern countries are now out of that. And they don't want to ever go back. So they decide kind of militantly, like, they don't, we got to get back to our traditions. Just like the evangelicals did, they come up with their core of beliefs. They rely heavily, not on the Quran, they rely on the Hadith. Did y'all study Islam a little bit? But the Hadith is a book of sayings that are attributed to Muhammad on what he said. So there's no telling whether, it's like, kind of like the Bible. And supposedly the Quran was not something Muhammad wrote, but Muhammad was given the the Quran in some cave or whatever. But it's at that point, that mid-century point, Israel has become a nation, the Middle East reacts. Then we start having wars, and we've been having these wars now for ever since. They've been going on for, thousands of years, so, but that pushes that, and it gives credence to some of these religious political leaders, is really what they are. Iran, so that's in the 1970s when they push out the Shah of Iran, and the Ayatollah Khomeini comes into power, and they had all that students back, and of course a lot of those students today that have grown up never wanted the country to go the way it did. But if you really want to read something about Islam and fundamentalism or some of the political stuff of today, there's a guy named Reza Aslan. Do y'all remember the book that came out? I don't remember if it was right before President Obama became president or after he became president, but he wrote a book, The Zealot. You remember it went on Fox News, and he was on Fox News, and they attacked him, and all that did was make his book go really up. It was on the bestseller list in New York for weeks after that Fox News episode. But he is an Iranian American. He lives in California. He's a professor at one of the University of California schools. And then there's Judaism, if you want to look at that. There are a number of people to look at. Judaism, how it, well, you see some of the problems even today, but I'm trying not to get into the 21st century, but it starts to take this political thing with its religious groups to the right. Hinduism, fundamentalism has taken is in Hinduism. And it's become a problem right now. I mean, some of the current events related to Hinduism or to India relate to this fundamentalist part. And also be aware that when fundamentalism kind of takes control, nationalism sets in. So that's a big part. But one of the big writers of Hinduism is a lady, she's a professor at Harvard, Diana Eck. I don't know if any of you ever heard of her. I had an opportunity to meet her one time, but she wrote a book about India, their religion, and she's written a number of books. But she has a thing, I look at it on Facebook, but it's called the Pluralism Project, and it's centered at Harvard, and she's the director of this project, and it supports all religions, and that's what her goal is. But she didn't go along with the fundamentalism part of that. But fundamentalism is a problem, and it's here, and we have to combat it. And I'm glad that I'm in a Unitarian church where I don't have to hear that all the time. We left it some years back. Even before I left it, I fought back, and they didn't like that. So, but I would say I had a class in Plano at First Baptist Plano for 7 years that I taught, and they knew how I was. I was very, very liberal compared to most of them. But they would come every Sunday just to see if whatever I'd say next. So you just, you can't just lay down because they're going to roll over. I mean, and we're having a problem today with it. So the 1980s kind of opened the door really for I think, a lot of the fundamentalism to be in power today, so. But hopefully, we'll move on, and our church, I think we're a good example of, we do need to get the word out. We need many younger people in this church, and that's the key. Many of the younger people are tired of church in general, so that's a good thing. They no longer want these traditional denomination things. They want something different. That's what the research shows. So it behooves us to try to get those people, and so that we can make a difference. Thank you.